Hi, everyone. My name is Riel Christian, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the launch of Dismantling the Master's Clock, the newest book by artist and advocate Rasheedah Phillips, published by AK Press. Tonight's event is presented by the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, a nonprofit research center and public forum for art, culture, and politics based at the New School. Dismantling the Master's Clock touches on themes of time, physics, and racial justice, delving into Black and Afrodiasporic conceptions of time where the past, present, and future interact in numerous constellations. Across 7 chapters, which seamlessly merge concepts from quantum theory, Black radical tradition, and science fiction with Rasheedah Phillips's own art and law practices, the book unpacks the notion of time as a supposedly objective imperative. As both a tool and a concept, time itself and the ways in which we mark, move through, and experience it is embedded with colonial agendas, a system imposed on us often through capitalistic constraints. As Rasheedah writes in the book's introduction, quote, "The historical embodiment of the master's clock can be traced back to the era of slavery, where the synchronization of time was not just a matter of coordinating actions, but a mechanism of subjugation. The political and existential stakes of this lack of temporal freedom cannot be overstated. For individuals and communities whose experiences and histories diverge from dominant narrative of progress, and particularly Black communities, this has led to misrepresentation, existential erasure, and political marginalization," end quote. The colonial desire for regulation and control contributes to our ongoing subjugation, our separation from one another and ourselves, and the displacement of Black and Indigenous communities the world over. But if time can be used as a tool to regulate the Black body, other epistemologies around time allow us to refuse and refute the constraints of colonial time, endowing us with our own tools, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, to quote Audre Lorde. Dismantling the master's clock, in Rasheedah's own words, seeks not only to expose the colonial underpinnings of the master's clock, but also to propose a reclamation and reconstruction of time that aligns with Black liberation. This re-envisioning is essential for true emancipation and the demolishing of the oppressive structures that continue to govern our lives," end quote. Here at the Vera List Center, we've had the pleasure of working with Rasheedah during her 2020 through 2022 VLC Fellowship, during our research theme entitled As for Protocols. Among other projects and collaborations, the outcomes of her fellowship were the exhibition, Time Zone Protocols, as well as the 3-day Prime Meridian Unconference, both of which underscored the protocols of time itself, while critically examining the political agendas that uphold Westernized time constructs, beginning with the global synchronization of time at the end of the 19th century. This process of synchronization, its technologies, motivations, and major players are the subject of Rasheedah's essay, Lines of Control, Navigating Tangled Timelines and Colonial Cartographies, which informs Chapter 4 of Dismantling the Master's Clock and appears in the Vera List Center's upcoming As for Protocols anthology, which will launch at the New School on Friday, March 21st. We're incredibly proud to continue our collaboration with you, Rasheedah, with tonight's event, and we're excited to share the honor of hosting you all in the Zoom space with AK Press. With that, I'll throw it over to you, Rasheedah. Thank you.
So with this presentation, I will essentially be reading an excerpt from my chapter, from a chapter in my book, in a specific section that I call Bending the Arrow of Time into a Circle.
Hillary Clinton is coming under fire for a racially tinged joke.
Sorry, Hillary. I was running on CP time.
That's not, I don't like jokes like that, Bill. That's not funny.
Cautious politician time.
That's Clinton taking part in a comedy routine at an annual media event in Manhattan with New York Mayor Bill de Blasio and a cast member from the Broadway hit Hamilton. CP time is often used playfully to mean colored people time, referring to a habit of being late. Overnight, de Blasio, whose wife is African American, told CNN it was all just a joke.
It was clearly a staged show, it was a scripted show, and the whole idea was to do the counterintuitive and say cautious politician time. Every actor involved, including Hillary Clinton and Leslie Odom Jr., thought it was a joke on a different convention. That was the whole idea of it. So I think people are missing the point here.
The comedy scale. Hillary Clinton is coming under fire.
CP time, CPT, colored people's time. It's a phrase that is often used to describe Black people as more prone to lateness compared to other racial and ethnic groups. It is a perception that stems from enduring negative stereotypes that portray Black people as being more laid back or lazy and unreliable, with a supposed lack of conscientiousness regarding time. Take, for example, a long-running Black joke relayed by American historian Lawrence W. Levine. At the time the world was made, people were allowed to select their own skin color and hair texture and style. Negro people arriving late as usual had to take what was left. Another joke has a man walking past a white church and hearing the congregation singing, "I'll be there when you open those gates," only to later walk past a Black church singing, "Don't close those gates till I get there." In his 1785 book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson spends a few pages detailing his observations on the inferiority of Black people to white people, both mentally and physically. He claims as an immutable truth that Black people are less intelligent, less capable of reason, and more prone to violence than white people. He believes that the differences between the races are insurmountable, unable to be overcome through education or socialization. Jefferson then spends a considerable number of words analyzing what he perceives as the Black sense of time, rhythm, and memory. And quote, "They seem to require less sleep. A Black, after hard labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up till midnight or later, though knowing he must be out with the first dawn of the morning. They are at least as brave and more adventuresome, but this may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought, which prevents their seeing a danger till it be present. When present, they do not go through it with more coolness or steadiness than the whites," end quote. Amid his racist diatribe, Jefferson momentarily acknowledges a paradoxical symbol of humanity, a glimmer of possibility yet to be proven. He remarks, "In music, they are more generally gifted than the whites with accurate ears for tune and time, and they have been found capable of imagining a small catch. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved." Here, Jefferson subtly highlights a relationship between racial perceptions and the understanding of time. He ultimately advances his conclusion that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and of mind. These comments are damning proof of the foundational narrative entanglement of race, space, and time that demarcates Black people as a distinct race. Our modern conceptions of race have long been shaped by temporal and spatial factors, particularly if we consider, and quote, "the collective trauma of slavery as the founding moment of modernity," as writer and filmmaker Kojo Eshun invites us to do, an echo of Toni Morrison's provocative contention that enslaved Africans enduring that foundational trauma should be viewed as the first moderns. The exploitation and regulation of Black bodies has been inextricable in constructing the conceptual framework of the modern world. The clocks that I have pictured up on the screen are at Monticello Plantation. And there was a different clock indoors and a different clock outdoors. And so people enslaved on this plantation couldn't tell the true time. Jefferson's ruminations on Black people reflects an observational methodology, a mechanism of clocking. The term clocking primarily refers to the act of recording or measuring time, such as an employee clocking in for work or a scientist logging changes in an experiment. Colloquially, clocking also denotes the act of noticing something or someone, or realizing something, often retrospectively. In some contexts, clocking can carry a physical connotation, describing the act of hitting someone, in which its metaphorical usage expresses the impact of a physical or emotional blow. For Black people, however, clocking retains a pernicious dimension across its various interpretations. In this context, clocking suggests the measurement of time as a means to assess the movement of Black CPT symmetry and Black space-time and enslaved laborers, and ensure that they are conforming to the master's clock. The white gaze, when surveilling Black people, compresses space and time, anchoring Black existence firmly within the reductive confines of a white supremacist chronology. This act of observation serves as a mechanism of disenfranchisement, embedding Black people within a narrative that frequently overlooks our historical and cultural narratives, erases them. And simultaneously, this methodology dogmatically enforces a Western, linear, and progress-driven temporal framework as the universal standard and shared governing rubric, dismissing the pluralities of time and perceptions beyond the Eurocentric view. Such enforcement perpetuates a singular and restrictive narrative on the ways that time and progress can be valued. The quantum Zeno effect is similar to this process of clocking, and it illustrates how continuous observation can inhibit the evolution of a quantum system, effectively freezing its state. Named after Greek philosopher Zeno of Ilia's famous paradox involving an arrow that, when observed, never seems to reach its final destination. This phenomena, as applied in quantum physics, supposes that a system cannot change its state while being watched. By continuous measurement, the state of a particle remains the same as the potential for change is interrupted by the act of observation itself, similar to the old adage, a watch pot never boils. That phrase, a watch pot never boils, is often attributed to Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. And this saying captures the experience of time dragging on when someone is waiting for something to happen, a perception of time influenced by the frustration of inactivity or impatience. It also suggests that obsessive attention might slow the passage of events. And it highlights a very goal-oriented outlook on time that becomes burdensome when progress is halted. And so by analogy, the relentless scrutiny and regulation of Black temporalities under the white gaze freezes or severely constrains the dynamicism and fluidity of Black temporal experiences. Just as the quantum Zeno effect reveals the dramatic influence of observation on the behavior of quantum systems, pervasive surveillance impedes the free evolution of identity and experience. But in marked contrast to the watch pot of the American proverb is the Sierra Leonean Creole saying, if you watch your pot, your food will not burn. In this more generative stance toward the relationship between attention and time, vigilance is seen as beneficial. It's seen as a nurturing action that ensures desirable outcomes. Rather than emphasizing the frustration of waiting, it instead endorses the rewards of mindful engagement. And in this process-oriented view of time, sustained attention is intrinsic to fostering the cycles of life and time as canvases for action and care, rather than just a countdown to a particular outcome. The ways in which different cultures understand and interact with this phenomena of time shapes both daily practices and outlooks on life and its rhythms. And so when Black people live beyond that scrutiny of the white gaze, a multiplicity of spatial and temporal states become possible. Black existence can then extend across various dimensions of space and time, free from the constraints of an imposed timeline. Jefferson's sensibilities about time, laziness, and labor align well with another aphorism often attributed to Benjamin Franklin as well, and that is time is money. So in his 1748 essay, Advice to a Young Tradesman, Franklin counseled, remember that time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor goes abroad or sits idle one half of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, ought not to reckon that the only expense he has really spent, or rather thrown away, 5 shillings besides, whatever that means. So 300 years later, the faces of Jefferson and Franklin are now stamped onto our nation's currency, and the phrase continues to tie efficiency and productivity to clock time, with implications that extend into the social economic stratification of society. That mathematics of capital and time acquires additional dimension given the context of chattel slavery and its enduring social economic legacy. Victims and survivors of this dehumanizing institution were not merely subjected to economic exploitation. Their very bodies and their temporal aspects of their labor were commodified, turning every aspect of their existence, from the rhythms of their work and rest to the velocity and productivity of their labor, into metrics for maximizing profits. For the enslaved Black people of 1748, the adage time equals money manifested as a cruel paradox. The privilege of owning time, a fundamental aspect of freedom, was an unattainable luxury. They could never possess the resource or currency of time. Rather, they themselves were transformed into that currency. They functioned as the very instruments that produced time and resources for their white enslavers, then and white society systematically into the present. It was their labor time, taken by force, often physically excruciating and violent conditions, that generated leisure time and the privilege to exercise autonomy over their schedules for their white masters. In the 1847 memoir of Isaac Granger Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's formerly enslaved blacksmith, he recounts that at the Monticello plantation, in quote, for amusement, he, Jefferson, would work sometimes in the garden for half an hour at a time, in the cool of the evening, underscoring the incongruity that enslaved laborers had to work in whatever conditions and at whatever times their masters dictated. Another observation from Thomas Jefferson himself in 1811 poignantly encapsulates the privileged hours of the white slave-owning class. In quote, from breakfast or even at the latest to dinner, I am mostly on horseback, attending to my farm or other concerns, which I find healthful to my body, mind, and affairs, end quote. His daily supervision of the plantation he experienced as leisurely and rejuvenating, a sentiment predicated upon the backbreaking labor of those he enslaved, labor performed under conditions of inherent violence and exploitation. Consider, too, that when Jefferson designed a great clock to be built by Peter Spruck of Philadelphia in 1792 and installed in the entryway to his Monticello house, it was constructed with both an exterior face on the outside of the building and an interior face inside. On the outside wall, the clock has only an hour hand, which Jefferson believed was accurate enough for outdoor laborers. The inside face of the clock reveals much greater precision by offering not only hour and minute hands, but also a smaller dial for a second hand. In its design, the master's clock made the distinction clear that plantation time was one thing for the slave owner and another for the enslaved. As formerly enslaved Black people transitioned to post-emancipation life, they found themselves still barred from existential dimensions of the future and much of their real-world manifestations. The Western linear paradigm of time was embedded in every facet of American life, including the social hierarchy, the burgeoning industrial economy, transportation, and communication. Time did not tick on indifferently. It was weaponized as a form of social and psychological control. The previous conditions of servitude were supplanted by the unyielding, ever-watchful master's clock, and eventually the regimentation of the industrial punch clock of labor time. And as Black people sought more control over their own labor during the lead up to and following the end of the Civil War, expressions like Negro time, Negro clocks, and permutations of the phrase colored people's time first began to circulate widely, linking Blackness with lateness and lack of productivity. These cultural myths were reinforced through the creation and distribution of racist American memorabilia from the late 19th century. Soon after emancipation, the associations grow increasingly pejorative. References to the old-time nigger, the nigger's clock, and the old-time darky surfaced in literature and newspaper articles. White writers lamented the loss of the mythological, joyful, docile Black slave who's the happiest of all living creatures and comes nearer being a joy forever than anything earthly, end quote. The association between clocks and the enslaved and formerly enslaved continued. Newspaper advertisements listed Black people alongside clocks and other inanimate objects as possessions, among taxable property. An 1840 newspaper ad in the Asheville Messenger lists carriages, slaves, clocks, watches, jewelry. Racist caricatures of Black people as clocks were prevalent in American memorabilia before the Civil War, through the Reconstruction era, Jim Crow, and even into the Civil Rights Movement. And to further institutionalize these tropes of white proscribed colored people time, and to maintain the stereotypes that would reinscribe Blackness as inherently inferior, Black people were not only metaphorically, but also literally objectified in the racist material cultures emblematic of American memorabilia, whether it's postcards, toys, clocks, and other trinkets that conjured a romanticized view of American history, depicting an idealized past when the country was more unified and innocent. This coincided with timekeeping devices like clocks and pocket watches gaining more popularity in the late 19th and early 20th century. Industrialization spurred the mass production and consumption of these timepieces, leading to a heightened societal preoccupation with punctuality and time management. Clocks and watches became widely coveted items. Images of American nostalgia, including racist Black caricatures, were also used to sell products such as food and household items, but also appeared in movies, cartoons, and other popular entertainment. Items often featured a Black figure with exaggerated features, oversized lips, bulging eyes. The Sambo figure, a recurring trope of a Black man as lazy, ignorant, and happy-go-lucky, emerged in literature around the late 1840s and was also a common image used in advertising and included on clocks and watches. Mammy imagery as well. That patents for such clocks existed and continue to exist demonstrates the deliberate and profitable mass manufacturing and market for racist Americana. Antique collector P.J. Gibbs' Black Collectibles Sold in America catalogs a 16-inch cast iron Sambo Winker figure with a Waterbury clock shaped as a banjo, noting that its eyes move up and down. The clock is marked as a scarce item that ranges in price from $3,300 to $4,000. The American context began to see colored people's time evolve into a phrase imbued with both cultural significance and subversive potential. A Black Chicago newspaper in 1912 reclaimed the term, framing it as a form of communal solidarity. And quote, "We have in our method of gathering what is commonly called, in the vernacular of the street, colored people's time," end quote, in 1912. Quickly, CPT underwent a semantic inversion within Black vernacular, moving from a stigmatized concept to one that fostered collective identity. However, this reclamation was not without its complications, as evidenced by the swift appropriation of the term by white individuals as an indication of being down or hip or a cookout invitee. So Carl Van Vechten, for instance, a white American writer, photographer, and patron of the arts, probably best known for his role in helping promote Harlem Renaissance movement in the 1920s and 30s, and for rubbing elbows with Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, etc., mostly regarded as a friend to the culture and later a supporter of civil rights movements. One of Van Vechten's works, the 1926 novel Nigger Heaven, was widely condemned at the time for its title and its appropriation of Black vernacular language, as well as his stereotypical portrayals of Black people as exotic and primitive. In one scene in the book, one character remarks to another that perhaps he's keeping CPT. At the end of that same book is a glossary with the definition of CPT. It's defined as colored people's time, i.e. late. Other definitions in the back of that novel include charcoal, which means Negro, and bull dyker, which means lesbian. Mary White Ovington, the daughter of wealthy white abolitionists and women's rights advocates, a suffragist, civil rights activist, and one of the co-founders of the NAACP, also felt entitled to use the term CPT. In 1932, she attended a meeting at a Black Methodist church, and reflecting on the visit in an essay recounts, "One night, the Methodist minister had supper with us, and as I was to speak on settlement work at his church at 7, I watched the clock, but he ignored it, and we did not get to the church until 7:30. Colored people's time is evidently derived from Southern people's time." Two years later, in her 1934 essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, Zora Neale Hurston makes legible how Black communities experience time in a way that was radically different from the conventions of dominant culture, though she never explicitly calls it colored people's time. She says, "It is the lack of symmetry which makes Negro dancing so difficult for white dancers to learn. The abrupt and unexpected changes, the frequent change of key and time are evidences of this quality in music." Note the St. Louis Blues, for example. The dancing of the justly famous Bojangles and Snake Hips are excellent examples. The presence of rhythm and lack of symmetry are paradoxical, but there they are. Both are present to a marked degree. There's always rhythm, but it's the rhythm of segments. Each unit has a rhythm of its own, but when the whole is assembled, it is lacking in symmetry, but easily workable to a Negro who is accustomed to the break and going from one part to another so that he adjusts himself to the new tempo. Here, Hurston regards the lack of symmetry found in Black time and rhythm as a feature, not a bug or a violation. In fact, she regards it as a fractal. And if it's to be regarded as a violation of symmetry, however, a unidirectional arrow of time descending into chaos does not follow, but in fact, something else altogether, something new and creative, emerges in the paradox created by this entanglement of rhythm and asymmetry. Compare, on the other hand, Hurston's observations to Jefferson, where he insists that Black people do keep time and rhythm well, better than whites. The term CPT continued to evolve, and by 2006, it received one of its first critical definitions in Geneva Smitherman's Word from the Mother as a reference to the African-American concept of time. According to Smitherman, CP time is being in tune with human events, nature, seasons, natural rhythms, not a slave to the artificial time of the man-made clock. Being in time, in tune with emotions, feelings, the general flow of things, is more critical than being on time, end quote. The challenge, as Smitherman articulates it, lies in reconciling this culturally ingrained in-time philosophy with the on-time demands of mainstream society, which often prioritizes punctuality over the nuances of interpersonal and emotional synchronicity. Despite these critical definitions of CP time that have evolved, the interpretation of time and Blackness within dominant culture, sociological, and medical narratives continue to bear negative connotations. The concept of presentism time orientation is a recurrent theme in studies exploring temporal perceptions among Black people, a theory identifying a pronounced emphasis on the immediacy of the present over the significance of the past or future. This orientation, often pejoratively associated with a lack of future planning and tendencies toward immediate gratification, has been misused to pathologize Black people as inherently lazy or irresponsible, especially in healthcare contexts. This problematic framing ignores the broader systemic injustices that shape these temporal orientations, including environmental racism, disenfranchised infrastructure, and the enduring legacy of segregated neighborhoods. Environmental racism, for instance, exposes Black communities to higher levels of pollution and denies them the benefits of clean air, water, and access to green spaces, significantly impacting their health and well-being. Disenfranchised infrastructure in predominantly Black neighborhoods, marked by inadequate public transportation, substandard housing, and limited access to essential services, further entrenches economic and social disparities. These conditions are not merely coincidental. They are the direct result of historical policies such as redlining and ongoing practices that spatially, temporally, and economically isolate Black people and communities. Attributing a presentism time orientation to Black people without acknowledging the historical and ongoing context of those things perpetuates harmful stereotypes and reinforces narratives that blame individuals for their circumstances, while ignoring the systemic roots of these conditions. My collective, Black Quantum Futurism, had an opportunity to go to CERN in Switzerland and do research. And so one of our initiatives was looking at CPT, which in science stands for charge, parity, and time reversal. And that really served as, and you can read more about it in the book, but it serves as a crucible for interrogating the very essence of time. And so from a scientific standpoint, but also from within the matrix of the socio-cultural time of Black experiences. And by unraveling what the term violation of time means, both in the context of physics and social justice, we enter a multidisciplinary discourse that echoes W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness to describe the two-ness that Black people experience in reconciling their identity as both American and Black. This duality can overlay the dynamic between the often marginalized nonlinear temporalities inherent to Black cultures and the linear monochromatic view of time often endorsed by dominant Eurocentric frameworks. In his work, Closure and Colored People's Time, John Streamus analyzes this dual consciousness as not only a mechanism for survival, but as also a site in which to imagine and even work toward liberation from racism. Streamus observes how, particularly in literary works by people of color, CPT, Colored People's Time, operates as a narrative tool to encapsulate visions of justice through a side shadowing that allows for the exploration of alternative historical outcomes. And so, unlike linear apocalyptic narratives that culminate in a final judgment, narratives informed by CP time often depict a cyclical or alternative sense of time that resists closure, emphasizing ongoing struggle and the possibility of different futures. And so drawing a parallel between the metaphor of double consciousness and quantum physics, Du Bois's two-ness can be likened to the quantum conundrum known as wave-particle duality, in which light is coerced into identifying as either a wave or a particle upon measurement. The duality is a fundamental concept in quantum mechanics, and it illustrates how physical objects can display characteristics of both waves and particles, depending on how one observes them. This reductionist act of observation truncates light's intrinsic multiplicity and its ability to exist in a fuller state when not pressed into a categorical choice. In a classical view, light was held to be either a wave demonstrated by phenomena, and when I say classical view, I mean in the traditional view of science, light was held to be either a wave demonstrated by phenomena such as diffraction and interference, or a particle, which was evidenced by things like the photoelectric effect, where light knocks electrons off of a material. And so Albert Einstein's explanation of this effect proposed that light consists of these sort of discrete packets of energy called photons, suggesting a particle nature, whereas other experiments suggested this wave-like behavior. And then quantum physics comes along and tries to reconcile these two findings by proposing that light in any quantum particle doesn't strictly exist as either a particle or a wave until it is measured. Before measurement, its state is a superposition of possibilities. And scientifically, this means that that very act of observing or measuring a quantum system affects its state. The reduction of all possible Black temporalities, culturally and spiritually derived, to conform to a linear, Eurocentric narrative diminishes them. By reconciling this two-ness, this wave-particle supposed duality, their lived reality in a racialized society, and the intrinsic cultural identity that resists such confines, a call emerges to reimagine our collective temporal structures. When we dig into the quirks and quirks of time, we can unearth understandings about both the mechanics of the universe and our cultural biases within the dominant paradigm. And that calls for recognizing that time operates as a multidimensional construct. It functions simultaneously as a device to organize, to mediate, and define human interaction and experience. European temporal hegemony works by overwriting those identities and experiences. This imposition of a unilateral narrative delegitimizes nonlinear and communal modes of timekeeping and reinforces our subjugation, the subjugation of Black communities, establishing a racialized construct of time. And so CP time, as it has been imposed on us, is Black time, temporalities read wrong on the master's clock, because they are essentially illegible to the white temporal imagination within the metric of being on time. The notion of colored people's time, mirroring the symmetry of the charge parity time theorem, can be understood as a metaphorical undoing of the unidirectional arrow of time, bending it back on itself and into a circle. This reconceptualization facilitates a multidimensional temporal landscape that defines those traditional linear constraints. And its implications are not just theoretical, but they truly offer us a blueprint for emancipation from the very systems that perpetuate our marginalization. In a society that continues to marginalize Black people as timeless, as uncivilized, as outside of time, as historically inconsequential, the dismantling of such temporal constructs is indispensable. This emancipation is more than adjusting histories that have been excluded or misrepresented Black existence. but it's really fundamentally about rewriting the temporal rules themselves. And such a liberation would allow Black people and communities not only to reclaim our time, but to redefine it, to create spaces where time bends to our cultural rhythms, to our historical reckonings, and to our futuristic aspirations, those that are uniquely our own. In this reimagined temporal landscape, Black communities possess the agency to construct worlds that honor our past, that cherish our present, that innovate for our futures. This holds the potential to not just reshape societal structures, but to launch new paradigms of thought, interaction, and existence where Black space-time matters, and Black experiences are recognized as foundational to our human stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rasheedah. That was, yeah, that was incredible. And it's great to hear you sort of bring all of these concepts together. And I know it's been such a fundamental part of your practice and thinking through sort of the misconceptions that people may have about time and how it connects to these sort of these deep histories of sort of negating it through through lived experiences, lived Black experiences. I I have a lot of questions, and there are a lot of ways our conversation could go, but yeah, I'm kind of um, this idea of environmental racism kind of stuck out to me, and um, the sort of history of well, the history of environmental racism, but also the concept of environmental time was something that also came out in the Prime Meridian Unconference, um, and I think comes out in places in your book. And in thinking about the environment, it's sort of bared witness to this deep this sense of deep time that really eludes us, as we're as human beings. We're only seeing just a fraction of this kind of greater yeah, greater time scale. And we kind of see this illusion in the kind of in the administrative decisions that are being made that actively harm the environment and exacerbate climate change, which of course disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities. And I don't know, I'm curious to hear you kind of talk through that idea um, of how, or sort of this kind of dual idea of deep time that eludes us, but also how the ways in which we can maybe enact it or call on it or make ourselves more aware of it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Um, yeah, I mean, there's so many things to say about it. I think in the book, I talk about it a lot in the sort of context of housing and sort of the built environment and how that's been shaped to exclude and segregate folks. And but I think there's a natural extension into the what we think of it as the environment in terms of nature or things that are outside of us. And I think you know, so much of the ways in which we move through the world has been because of the bifurcation of ourselves from the so-called environment, and why we as humans don't get to necessarily feel or experience deep time because of that separation, right? Like, or and I'll just, when I say this, I speak very broadly, right? Like, because of course there's like, of course there's cultures and communities that do retain those connections, right? And that's what we're in some ways looking to get back to. But broadly in our American culture, we're separated. We see ourselves as separated. We think in very binary ways, and right. And so things that are in nature, things that are in the environment are out there, and we are somehow in here, and we don't see ourselves in that way. And this is why, right, things are the way that they are, because we don't have those relationships, and we don't see ourselves as critically interconnected or intertwined with the environment. And so our experience of time as humans is falsely accelerated or can be sort of manufactured through these kind of objects that really don't have anything to do with nature. So when you look at the clock, right, the clock is not necessarily beholden to the sun or the way in which the earth spins, right? It's a artificial sense of time that's created through a clock, and then that's tied to labor. And so we divorce ourselves more and more from the environment, and that just shows up in how we think about time, how we move through the world with finality, with like we're moving towards a thing that ends, right? But I think, you know, what I talk about in the book and have always talked about, right, is that things like Afrofuturism and other ways of thinking about space and time, looking at indigenous relationships to time, to space, to the environment, Native American, indigenous, Black, indigenous, all of those things, right? They offer us not anything new, right, but ways of being that have always existed, that have been obscured, that offer those deep relationships to time, deep relationships to the environment, give us ways and rituals to access deep time when we can't do that in our just everyday life moving through, right? So there's tools out there, even though it feels like we can't access them in a day-to-day.
Yeah, I was thinking about sort of well, what you were saying about sort of this history of collection of clocks and how maybe that relates to some of what you were saying about the ways that as a kind of manifestation of the colonial gaze, you have this bifurcation or this kind of structuring of nature or natural phenomena. And so the clock is kind of an extension of that, and it became this kind of fetish object, this desire to hold something that is this kind of symbol of control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I go through that in detail and just, you know, and that was part of my Vera List Center project as well, as looking at histories of this object and what this object has meant and represented. And, you know, just some things that because we take it so for granted, because the object is so built into our everyday life, it's almost like it's disappeared in the background because it's always there, but underlying. And so when you look at it, right, like the clock itself shows up in these colonial histories of being, you know, like, for example, the reason why Cook was able to get to Australia eventually was because of perfections and technological improvements made to a type of clock that people could take on a ship, and it could help them to determine longitude so that they weren't crashing into other ships all the time, right? And so that technological improvement of this object, a very specific thing, being able to find time, right, like enabled folks to get further and further. So it undergirds so much of our history, but it's allowed to be obscure in that way because we all use it, we all own one, right? And it's able to hide sort of those histories behind itself. And it functions like a map in that way, right? Like we look at a map and you don't always think of all of the different like colonial bullshit that went into creating that map, and you know, all of the white supremacist bullshit that went into erasing the original maps of the land of wherever, you know, whoever's native to those particular places. And so the clock does the same thing in terms of erasing indigenous space times, indigenous ways of counting time and reckoning time. And that's not to say that like every culture and community has used like circular time or like not, you know, a lot of communities have thought about time in linear ways. Is not to say that, but it's just to say that this sort of white supremacist time that has a very specific history connected to science, connected to all of the things, right, emerges. And just like as we're starting to over the past couple decades talk about science in that way, talk about the complicated history of science and how it has particularly been born of pain and oppression and violence against Black people, we can now talk about time in that same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of the yeah, kind of deconstructing this idea or disabusing ourselves of this notion that time or aspects of medical science or sort of map making are these kind of seemingly objective processes, but they are really tied to systems of power, and the people sort of in control of those systems are the ones kind of really shaping them, and it does kind of very visibly impact the ways that we navigate the world and kind of our own relations to one another, our access to one another, and it's very much by design. And since you brought up the fellowship project, I also wanted to return to what you were saying about sort of the reductiveness and disenfranchisement of the white gaze. And in the book, in one of the quotes that I mentioned, you sort of discuss how the synchronization of time more or less coincides with the legal end of slavery. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk through those connections a bit more.
Can you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, in the book, and you also touched on this earlier in your presentation, but how the synchronization of time, and I'm thinking specifically about the Prime Meridian conference, or what is it called? Not the Prime Meridian conference, but the International Meridian Conference, and how that coincides sort of within decades of the legal end of slavery.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what I was exploring through that is, again, looking at the connections between the Prime Meridian Conference of 1884 and some of the vestiges of slavery that were still flowing even after so-called emancipation, and also talk about sort of the coincidence of the Berlin conference that happened, that was used to spatially divide Africa. And so you have these sort of two space-time things happening, and attempts to mechanize and gain even more control over the world, right? And so synchronizing these time zones across the and it took decades to do this, right? Like, it's not something that happened overnight, but a determination was made at a place in time with, you know, a few privileged few people who decided this, right? And those, based on those decisions, we see the world start to conform slowly over time, to create these time zones that use Greenwich in England as their marker, as the sort of 0 point for the rest of the world. And so you see, right, based on that, how things like economics and our markets and all of those things conform to that basic sense of time. So yeah. So that's part of what I was researching, but then also looking at that again in the context of what particular impacts that has had on Black people, and the various systems that come under that. And so looking at things like daylight savings time and that connection, and the present day sort of use of daylight saving time and the impacts that daylight savings time has. And just, again, thinking about that artificial manipulation of time, that it is not a natural thing. It's not based on things like the geography of a place and the time that the sun sets or the time that the sun rises, et cetera, right? It's based on someone setting a clock in a place that is far removed from the communal and local context of that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sort of responding without responding to some of the comments in the chat, would you think of your book as being kind of, or your work in general, kind of rooted in, specifically speaking to kind of an American audience, or not American, but United States kind of history of subjugation of Black people, of Black communities? Or, I mean, there are more expansive applications of it, and I think there are many epistemologies around time and kind of shared solidarities in or kind of jointly beneficial sort of it's a jointly beneficial endeavor to think through time in this critical construct. And I'm wondering how you see your work as being applicable in these ways.
And can you repeat that question?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was a question.
No worries.
Yeah, the work is kind of rooted in the history of the United States and kind of the history of enslavement and the subjugation of Black people, the ongoing subjugation of Black communities. But are there other applications outside of a US context, outside of a Black context?
Um, I mean, I think for me, I write this work for Black people and from my personal experiences. And so I think for any identity we can claim, it comes with its own temporal framework. So whether it's gender, disability, the geography of where you're born, right? I talk about in the book how if you're born in a certain part of North Philadelphia, your life expectancy is lower, right? And so, right, any identity that we claim is going to come with a sort of temporal framework. But because I exist at particular intersections, right, I'm speaking to those experiences, to the temporalities, those blends of temporalities that I suppose are inherently sort of like queer if we're juxtaposing it to whiteness. But I think our experiences ultimately transcend those categories. And to even like to try to name all the complexities is futile. Like in some ways, even calling it Black time or referring to Black temporalities on the one hand, it like kind of functions to reduce it to this sort of mundane thing, and it sort of even risks essentializing Blackness, right? And so I try to be very careful in the book with that. I'm not at all trying to essentialize Blackness, and I think there is a danger in that. But on the other hand, right, like what I'm arguing in the book is that Blackness is ever expansive and multidimensional. It's both rupture and possibility, as so many folks have taught us. So it's really helpful, right, to think about this work in the context of ways that it, when we think about time, that it should be practiced and experienced with community, that it should be used to honor those sort of cultural ways, those inner and outer parts of our lives that we can control, or where we feel like we can creatively direct our destinies. And so for that reason, yeah, like this stuff is applicable in a variety of contexts, but I think I write from a very specific context to a very specific context, and I want that to be clear.
Yeah, it's a good answer to my non-question. And we have quite a few questions coming in the chat. But I also wanted to ask you about, well, we sort of talked about the kind of spatial segregation that time affords. And in the book, you also speak about sort of the histories of redlining and exclusionary zones. And you speak through this relationship between time and a kind of geographical separation. And then you also talked about, and kind of going back to this idea of the connections between the supplantation of local time with a sense of global time, and the end of legal slavery. I think I'm talking myself into another non-question, but Saidiya Hartman in Scenes of Subjugation also talks about how on the plantation, enslaved people would steal time away by kind of creating these moments of or finding their own moments of joy and sadness and anger kind of beyond the master's gaze. Yeah. And yeah, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I in the book talk a lot about what exists outside of, the master's clock and the master's gate. And it's examples, right? Like these things are about being in community and being with people and just noticing, again, things from, we can talk about different songs from our culture, or things that, I wrote a piece the other day, a few weeks ago, about different songs from my childhood that reference time, that reference Black time and Black joy, that, I didn't always like notice the lyrics, but when I go back to hear them, I'm like, yes, that's what it's speaking about. It's speaking about these different ways that we persevere, that we move through time, without explicitly saying it. And I talk about things like and this was left out of the book, but I do an analysis of like different sci-fi films and how they utilize Black time or Black temporalities in their narratives and in their different stories, right? So yeah, there's lots of different examples of that. And I think that's a part of like the Black quantum futurism practice in general, is all these different ways and of mapping or remapping, right? Our temporal landscapes. We have a practice called the quantum event map, where folks are able to map out different aspects of an event that sometimes eludes our memory. Things like, you know, what time, what was playing, or what were the background sounds when a particular experience happened, or thinking about future experiences that we want to come together, and like what are the elements of that experience. So just like breaking down time in these different ways that aren't just, again, beholden to a clock time or a calendar date or whatever. So yeah, it's all about that. And you know, I'm not claiming time to be any particular thing either. Again, you know, I'm speaking from my personal experiences with this, but as well as some research and some things where we can compare and align, and to say that, you know, there are other ways to move through this world, and other ways of thinking about reality that aren't beholden to the colonial histories and presents and futures that are imposed upon us. And so that, yeah, that's what it's about. And it's like, it can be as small as like a cookout, a Black cookout, right? Like that's how we create time together. And I talk about this a lot in terms of working in North Philadelphia, in a community that a longstanding community that was being displaced, and some of the narratives that was coming out about the history of that community that were extremely disparaging, but that you could see connected to their justifications for coming into that community and taking that community. And doing redevelopment in that community. And so being able to document and talk about the moments of joy, the moments of resistance, the moments of lots of like different historical figures, music figures, jazz figures that were being left out of the narrative of this community, that was able to be pushed through when the community had the space and ability to amplify their voices and their experiences and their histories of that community, right? And so that was a form of being able to push back, even just laying down their story and having that story amplified through the news, or being told you can come down to City Hall and talk about this thing that's happening to your community, and making space for that. So these are the moments of like Black temporalities that, you know, we try to honor and uplift it through our practice, and then also through the book to try to recognize.
Yeah. Thank you. I can maybe turning to the chat, I can read through some of these questions. Looks like Jean Shepper wanted to know, or wanted to say, I hope to teach your book in a gender and sexuality studies graduate class with a focus on methods of research. I would love to hear anything that might speak to how you approach research or creative approaches to knowledge production. Thank you for your work.
So how I approach research and knowledge production, it's super organic. So for me, much of my career has been as a practicing attorney. I was doing a lot of work in Philadelphia representing people being displaced, being evicted from their homes. And so research was like really difficult to come by. And a lot of it just happened more organically, in terms of like the stuff I was interested in reading, and like researching and noting things and saving them for future use. And then a lot of my research presently takes place through like artistic stuff. So when I'm planning for an exhibition, planning for other things. And so you'll see actually a lot of references in the book to my artistic practice, and the ways that I've researched a thing that has later turned into an exhibition or some other type of artistic project. So sometimes things happen that way, which is less organic, right? Like I'll be commissioned, or I'll have a fellowship, and that creates the time and space to do it, even though it feels, or I guess yeah, it feels inorganic in some ways, right? But it's also creating the conditions that I wouldn't otherwise have to be able to think through and build out another body of research. So that's kind of how it happens. Happens in between the day job that is more than a day job. It's like extends into the night. But fortunately, in the position that I'm in now, there's a lot of overlap, and I'm able to, because my job really honors art and culture as a strategy towards our work, to bring that into my work. And so when right now I'm working on a big thing around spatial futures and reparative spatial justice at my job, which includes having fellowship and publications and other things. And that allows me to do a lot of research around reparative spatial justice and connect that to my work on temporal justice and temporal, all the things that are in the book. So yeah, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, nothing at all straightforward or linear.
But all connected in different ways. Yeah. Can we learn about that work on your website?
You can. So I have a website, rasheedah.net. And on there, you'll see links to all my different projects. And then Black Quantum Futurism is our collective project. And then there's like different websites. So like Time Zone Protocols has its own website. We have a website called Black Time Belt that's looking at all Black towns and settlements in the United States that have been erased or disappeared, or places like Tulsa where there have been vicious race massacres and other places. And so that site documents some of those places. And so we have a bunch of different like offshoots of our work.
So going to another question, Dr. Carol Ann Dixon says, thank you for an excellent presentation. Regarding the section of your talk and slides on Black and Afrodiasporic temporalities, I'd be interested to hear or to know whether your research for this new book included analysis of the West African, Ghanaian, parentheses, Akan heritage, principles of Sankofa, which I know that it does. So maybe you want to.
Absolutely, yes. That was an easy one to answer. Yes. And I look at other contexts as well. I rely a lot on, there's a encyclopedia of African religions and cultures that documents a lot of the sort of spatialities and temporal practices of African cultures and civilizations. And so I relied a lot on that to look at different countries and places in their practices.
And then the other part of this question, are Sankofa principles and other African origin philosophies integral to your analysis of alternatives to Western and Eurocentric conceptualizations of time?
Absolutely, they are. But also I recognize my limitations in that I'm coming from a Black American context. And so there's only so far I can go in terms of just analysis. And I never want to like go too far to try to, impose a different context onto an American context. I think there's a lot of rich Black American specific cultural traditions that I try to uplift as well. And of course, recognize their origin, recognize where they're flowing from, and recognizing that, in terms of the Afrodiaspora, like these things are all connected. There is an interconnection, there is an alignment, there is, in some cases, you can think about it like one for one, that this thing applies and this thing came from a very specific place. But in other ways, right, like we've developed our own cultural practices and norms and space-time rituals here, and I try to tap into those as well, because I never want to like go too far to say, right, like again, it's not my context or lived experience, and so I try to stick to that as much as possible, recognizing the limitations of research and also just encroachment on other cultures, right? Like, yes, I'm Black, but that doesn't mean I can claim all of Blackness or all cultures, right? So I try to bring in a level of respect to how I do the research and name that, right? Like name that limitation. And so I do talk about that a little bit in the book of like, this involves some generalizations, this involves, right, like research that I've been doing for a long time, but it's not my lived experience. And so I try to name that where I can and just, be respectful.
Yeah. And also as a side note, I mean, everyone should buy the book if that wasn't clear, but there's such generous endnotes and footnotes in the book, where you kind of map out all of these different areas of research, and you can really see how the connections, all of these kind of through lines between your different modes of practice and philosophy. And so, yeah, that's also just such a rich and generative space within the book. And let's see, Jonathan wanted to know, can you speak more about more on the aspects of Zeno's immobility arrow, that is an invisible force that passively passes through us and creating this sorry, I'm butchering this question. Can you speak more about the aspects of Zeno's immobility arrow, that is an invisible force that passively passes through us and creating this eternal freezing of time that disrupts the ability to reach a deeper side of experience?
No, I cannot in this moment. That is a complex question that would require me to not have worked all day and then just did a long speech. It sounds like a very smart question, and I would love to talk philosophy and Zeno's paradox anytime, offline or in another conversation.
Yeah, it's a very good question, but yeah. Um,
I love the question.
um, Possibly similarly, Ari Allen wants to know, I'd love to hear more about deep time, the elements of that, and some of the ways it's experienced.
Yeah, so I don't go a lot into deep time in my book. I think there's a lot of other books that do. Actually, I have a book right here. Let me grab it so I can share the title of it. There's this really great book that does go into this that I suggest you read. It's called Timescales: Thinking Across Ecological Temporalities, and it's edited by Bethany Wiggin, Carolyn Fornoff, and Patricia Unji Kim. So I would suggest reading through this if you want. Look at that, exactly.
Hey.
And this talks about all types of different time scales. It talks about Anthropocene, it talks about glaciers, icicles, all those things. So I would look into that. I do reference this a little bit, and so it's getting at this very top of the surface of deep time, if you will. But in one of the chapters, I think the last chapter, I talk about time capsules, and I talk about the burying of time capsules and unearthing of time capsules and sort of that connection to time. And I also talk about underneath St. Louis, there's a system of caves, and there's local legends, stories, narratives that enslaved Africans used those the tunnels in those caves to escape and to cross the river. And so I referenced that and did some artwork around that paid homage to those caves. And so we talk about it a little bit, but it does not get into nearly the detail that like a book like Timescales does.
Mhm. There's also part of the Primeridian Unconference, and then part of the book, As for Protocols, your collaborator, Mitch McEwen, has this interview and presentation about sort of cloud time and the ways of kind of another way of thinking of through the sort of deep time of the environment, and sort of the space between clouds and the ocean. It's a really beautiful conversation. Um, and yeah, and then it was also
Yeah, and that conversation is with a climate scientist, and they also connect it to collectivity and collective time, and give an example of unionizing and thinking about collective time and cloud time in that context. So that a recording and transcript of that conversation is available in the Time Zone Protocols website.
I think we have a link for the As for Protocols ebook somewhere, maybe someone. Thank you. And let's see. Giannis asked, I am curious what would be a liberated or emancipated experience of time? How can someone achieve total control of their time, and how would someone know what's the optimal way to use their time?
Yeah, I don't know that I can engage with that question. And I think it cuts against probably what I'm talking about in the book around communal and collective time. Like I can't determine that for someone else. And the book is not about that. It really is about when we talk about liberating time, we're talking about it in a specific context for Black people and what that has meant in Black people's communal history. And not assuming whatever this person's race is, but I can't speak to like what it means to liberate yourself individually. That's something I'm still trying to figure out for myself. So let alone me being able to answer that for someone else. But again, the book and my work and like the websites and everything contain a lot of different tools to think about that, to reflect on what that means for yourself, what that ultimately looks like. I think it depends on you, depends on your community, depends on how you spend time and what feels like liberation to you. I think the time zone protocols project is one to look at, to kind of dig into, and again, would direct folks to that website. There's a lot of different questions and ways of just like mapping yourself against how you might want to think about experiencing time, but ultimately, like that question is deeply personal, deeply communal, deeply contextual.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Let's see if there are no other questions. Oh, well, Diane has another question. If there's time for an additional question, do you see this project contributing to reparations? I think this text increases our ability to extend claim-making practices, which is exciting.
Absolutely, I do. I think, and when I talked about the project that I'm doing at my job called Spatial Futures, and we talk about temporalities in the context of reparative spatial justice, and that spatial justice, yeah, we can't talk about spatial justice if we're not talking about temporalities, because spatial injustice extends in time. When we talk about things like redlining, all of those things, we're talking about temporal justice. And so when we talk about repair, we also have to be talking about temporality. Just to give a concrete example, like redlining didn't just restrict where people could buy homes, and I talk about this in the book. It also dictates long-term accumulation of wealth. It dictates where a family can move. It dictates that family's future. When we look at things like highways that were built through Black communities, right? These are spatial things, but how they act in time, right? They work to compress time and space, excuse me, for certain communities. For other communities, like for privileged communities, that infrastructure of a new highway speeds up access to opportunity, but for marginalized communities, right, it slows down movement in those particular communities. And so you can't talk about, I think, spatial injustice without talking about temporal injustice, and that question of repair extends into time. So when we're talking about repair, often it's like, what are we repairing when, right? And that question also becomes a straw man because, right, again, the harm didn't just happen at one point in time. That's now in the past, right? That harm continues. That harm is connected to the present and presumably the future. And so in order to do repair, we have to be talking about time. So yes.
I think that's a really wonderful note to end on. Unless you have any other kind of afterthoughts, Rasheedah.
No, I don't. I just thank everybody for showing up and engaging and for the questions. And I will be doing some additional in-person conversations on the East Coast. So join me if you're on that end. We'll be in New York the second week of March doing a performance, doing some other talks. And so if you go to rasheedah.net, all the information of where we'll be is on the website. Well, thank you so much. And congratulations to you all too on the book.
Thank you so much. And I'm just putting in a link in the chat. I think this is the list of other events for Dismantling the Master's Clock. Yeah, thank you so much, Rasheedah. It's such a joy to be able to talk to you and to discuss this wonderful book. And I just want to thank everyone in attendance for joining us for the launch of Dismantling the Master's Clock, and copies are available through AK Press. Join us for our next event, the launch of As for Protocols, on Friday, March 21st, which will feature contributors Salome Sega, Shannon Mattern, Silas Reiner, and Robert Sember of Ultra Red. And I also just want to thank my colleagues at the Vera List Center, Tabor Banker and Adrienne Ume, Ariel Pira and Karen Kwoni for their support in organizing and hosting tonight's event. And thank you to Sophia Hussein at AK Press for enormous support. Couldn't be here tonight, but shout out to Sophia. And yeah, thank you all again.